There are names in history that make the world fall silent. Names that carry both fear and fascination. Adolf Hitler is one of them. He was not born a monster. He was a child once. Quiet, lonely, dreaming of becoming an artist. He painted skies, buildings, faces, and believed beauty could be captured on paper. But somewhere along the way, that dream turned into something else, something darker. This is not a story made to excuse. It is a story made to understand, to ask how an ordinary life could twist into something that changed the world forever. Because evil rarely arrives wearing its true face. It begins with disappointment, with humiliation, with the hunger to be seen. And if no one stops it, it grows. It learns to speak. It begins to lead. In the ruins of World War I, a broken young man found purpose in anger. He turned pain into power, words into weapons, and the world followed until everything burned. But before we talk about the dictator, the war, the devastation, we need to go back to the boy, to the quiet streets of Austria, to the sketches that once dreamed of light before they were swallowed by darkness. This is not a tale of politics. It is a journey through a human soul, one that shows how fragile the line between creation and destruction can be. Let us begin where it all began, before the world knew his name, before the fire, before the fall. Chapter 1. The Boy from Braunau. He was born on a cold April morning in 1889 in a small Austrian town called Braunau am Inn, a quiet border place where the river flowed softly and the sound of church bells marked the rhythm of simple lives. No one could have imagined that from this small house would rise a man who would one day set the world on fire. His father, Alois, was strict and proud, a customs officer who believed in rules, discipline, and respect. He carried himself with authority, and his word was law at home. His mother, Clara, was the opposite, gentle, patient, and kind. She was the warmth that filled the silence his father left behind. To her, little Adolf was everything. To him, she was the only light in a house ruled by order and fear. The arguments between them grew sharper each year. The father saw stubbornness, the son saw misunderstanding. Adolf's drawings were torn, his ideas dismissed, and something inside him began to harden. Each fight left a mark, invisible but deep. He began to hide his sketches, to protect the small world that still belonged to him. At school, he was bright but unpredictable. When he cared, he excelled. When he didn't, he failed without regret. He wanted attention but rarely found it. He wanted success but hated authority. His teachers saw promise, but also danger, a boy with pride greater than patience and dreams larger than discipline. When his father died, Adolf was 16. Some said he felt sorrow. Others said he felt free for the first time. But freedom without direction is a dangerous thing. Soon, he left school, chasing the vision that had lived in his heart since childhood, to become an artist. In Vienna, he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts. He believed this was his moment, his destiny. But the letter came back, rejected. The judges said his drawings lacked life, lacked emotion. They saw skill in his buildings and streets, but no soul, no people. It was a rejection he could not understand. He tried again and failed again. The door to his dream had closed. The rejection cut deep. He wandered the streets of Vienna, sleeping in shelters, selling small paintings to tourists for coins. The city was beautiful, but cold. Music echoed from grand theaters, while hunger filled the alleys. He watched the rich pass by in carriages, their laughter carried by the wind. Around him, he saw beggars, workers, and faces filled with despair. Vienna became his teacher, but its lessons were cruel.
He began to ask questions. Why some had everything while others had nothing? Why talent could go unseen? Why effort could still end in failure? And slowly, the artist's heart began to darken. Bitterness replaced hope. Blame replaced wonder. Then the final blow. His mother's death. Clara, the one person who had loved him without condition, was gone. Her illness came quickly, her pain unbearable. Adolf stayed by her side until the end. When she died, something in him broke. He wept for days, then fell silent, as if a part of his soul had gone with her. After that, he drifted through life like a ghost. Vienna's streets became both his home and his prison. No one noticed him, just another face among the forgotten. A failed artist, a lost dreamer. But history was already watching, waiting for the moment when loneliness would turn into purpose, when rejection would become rage, and when the boy from Braunau would begin to change the fate of millions. Chapter 2. The Making of Belief. Vienna, the city of dreams and despair. For Adolf Hitler, it was both a teacher and a mirror. He arrived with hope and left with anger. He had come to paint, to find beauty, to create light. But the city showed him another face. Every corner spoke of struggle. Men waited in bread lines. Women begged with children in their arms. The rich lived in warmth. The poor froze in silence. Vienna was alive, but its heart was divided. He wandered through museums, sketching statues and buildings. Art was still his refuge, but hunger made it harder to dream. Each rejection from the academy echoed in his mind. Each night spent in the shelter deepened his resentment. He watched others succeed while he disappeared into the crowd. In the streets, he heard voices, angry, desperate voices. They spoke of betrayal, corruption, and injustice. They cursed the government, the bankers, the foreigners. He listened. He agreed. And slowly, he began to believe. He wandered through museums, sketching statues and buildings. Art was still his refuge, but hunger made it harder to dream. Each rejection from the academy echoed in his mind. Each night spent in the shelter deepened his resentment. He watched others succeed, while he disappeared into the crowd. In the streets, he heard voices, angry, desperate voices.
They spoke of betrayal, corruption, and injustice. They cursed the government, the bankers, the foreigners. He listened. He agreed. And slowly, he began to believe. He read constantly. Politics, history, philosophy, race, power. The words filled the emptiness where his dreams had died. Books became his new teachers. He found comfort in ideas that divided the world into strong and weak, winners and losers. He began to imagine himself not as a failure, but as someone chosen, someone with a mission to correct what was wrong. In the crowded shelters, he started to speak, at first only to a few, then to more. His voice carried conviction, sharp, confident, filled with anger and strange passion. Some mocked him, but others listened. They saw in him what he was beginning to see in himself, a man with vision, with purpose, with fire. He had found something more powerful than art. Words. They could move hearts, stir crowds, reshape reality. What his hands could not create, his voice could command. Then came 1914. The world changed overnight. War. The posters called it glory, duty, destiny. Hitler saw it as salvation. For the first time, he belonged somewhere. The army gave him order, pride, and purpose. The uniform erased the failure of the artist. Now he was part of something greater, a nation. He fought bravely, survived battles that killed thousands. The medals pinned to his chest became symbols of meaning, proof that he mattered. The chaos of war felt like clarity to him, but when it ended, that clarity was gone. Germany lost. The empire collapsed. The soldiers returned home not as heroes, but as broken men. Hunger filled the streets again. Hope turned into anger. For Hitler, the defeat was unbearable. He could not accept that the country he loved had fallen. He searched for someone to blame: politicians, foreigners, Jews, anyone who in his eyes had betrayed Germany. The bitterness he carried from Vienna now found its direction. He joined small nationalist meetings in Munich, rooms filled with shouting men who shared his rage. They spoke of pride, revenge, rebirth. He listened at first. Then he spoke. And when he did, the room fell silent. His words were harsh, but magnetic. He spoke with pain, with belief. The failed artist had found his new canvas, the human mind. His brush was language. His color was fear. His art was persuasion. He began to see himself not as a victim, but as a messenger. A man chosen to awaken a sleeping nation. The dream of beauty had turned into the dream of power. The boy who once painted the world as he wished it to be now sought to reshape it by force. Vienna had denied him a place among artists, but it had given him something else: belief. And from that belief, the world would burn. Chapter 3.
The Rise of the Voice. Munich, 1919. A city in ruins. The war was over, but peace had not come. Germany was wounded. Its people wandered like ghosts, searching for meaning among the ashes. The streets were filled with noise, arguments, protests, hunger. Everyone blamed someone else. The government was weak, the economy was broken. The pride of a nation had turned into shame. And in that chaos, small political groups began to appear, each one promising salvation. One of them was the German Workers' Party, a handful of men, angry, restless. They met in beer halls, shouting about revolution and revenge. Most nights nothing came of it, until one evening a man stood up to speak. He was thin, his mustache small, his eyes sharp and burning. His name was Adolf Hitler. At first no one paid attention, but then he began to speak.
His voice rose slowly, then broke into thunder. He spoke of betrayal, of humiliation, of enemies within. The words hit like hammers. The crowd leaned closer, drawn by the rhythm, the fury, the strange beauty of his speech. He did not read. He performed. Every gesture was deliberate. Every pause carried tension. He turned silence into power. He made anger sound like hope. He spoke not to the mind, but to the heart, to the wound that every German carried. That night, something changed. The small party noticed him. They asked him to return, and he did, again and again. Each time the crowds grew larger, the applause louder. He had found his gift, the voice. A voice that could command attention, awaken emotion, shape belief. He studied it like a weapon, practiced in front of mirrors, measured every word, every glance, every breath. He knew how to make people feel what he wanted them to feel. By 1923, his voice filled beer halls, theaters, city squares. He spoke to workers, soldiers, mothers, and students. Each group heard what they needed: hope, pride, revenge. He gave them a story to believe in, and they believed. But belief is dangerous when it is built on rage. The more they listened, the more they followed. The more they followed, the more they surrendered. He was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, the reflection of every fear, every dream, every wound of a nation. And as his voice grew louder, so did the silence of those who doubted him. The boy from Braunau had once dreamed of painting beauty. Now, with words instead of brushes, he began to paint something far darker. A vision not of art, but of destiny.
Chapter 4. The Attempted Revolution. Munich, November 1923. The city was restless again. Shops were empty. Money had lost its meaning. People carried baskets of paper bills that could not buy a loaf of bread. Germany was starving, desperate, waiting for someone to act. And in the middle of that storm stood Adolf Hitler. His voice had grown stronger, his crowds larger, his belief unshakable. He had convinced himself that destiny was calling. He told his followers that Germany needed courage, and he was ready to give it. To him, words were no longer enough. He wanted action. He wanted to seize the government, to take power with his own hands. He believed history would remember him not as a speaker, but as a savior. One cold evening, he gathered his men. Brown uniforms, red armbands, boots echoing on cobblestone streets. They marched through the city under torchlight. The air smelled of smoke and hope. Their destination was the Bürgerbräu Keller, a large beer hall where politicians were meeting. Inside, the room was full. Hundreds of men sat with their drinks, talking politics, unaware of what was coming. Then the doors burst open. Armed men stormed in. Shouts filled the air. Chaos followed. And there he was, standing on a table, pistol raised, face burning with conviction. "The national revolution has begun," he cried. For a moment, the room froze. Some laughed. Some stared in disbelief. Others waited to see if it was real. It was not a revolution. It was theater, but it felt powerful. He believed Germany would rise behind him. He thought soldiers would join, that generals would follow. He imagined the city falling in line under his command. But the next morning, reality arrived. The army surrounded them. Streets filled with soldiers, not supporters. Gunfire echoed through Munich. The march collapsed before it truly began. Hitler's men scattered. Some were killed, others fled. He was arrested soon after, dragged through the streets like a criminal. The dream of glory turning to dust. The newspapers mocked him. The government called him a fool. The revolution had lasted less than a day. It should have ended there. But in prison, something else began. Behind iron bars and cold walls, his anger turned inward, then outward again. He began to write. His pen replaced his pistol. His words became his new weapon. He wrote about destiny, about race, about revenge. He blamed everyone but himself. And in those pages, he built a story that would later destroy millions. He called it Mein Kampf, my struggle. Each word came from belief, blind, bitter, unbroken. He saw himself as chosen, misunderstood, destined for greatness. He told himself that failure was only the beginning, that power could not be taken by force. It had to be built through faith and patience. In that cell, he began to change. He grew quieter, colder, more controlled. He learned that people did not follow the strongest. They followed the one who made them believe they were strong. When he walked out of prison months later, he was no longer the failed revolutionary. He was a man with a plan, a story, a purpose. He knew now that guns could not win him Germany, but words could. He left behind the fantasy of a single night's revolution. Instead, he began to build something slower, darker, a movement that would rise from despair and disguise itself as hope. And though he left his cell behind, the walls never truly left him. They became part of his mind, a place where rage could grow quietly, where belief could harden into destiny, and where the dream of power would wait until the world was ready to listen again. Chapter 5: The Path to Power. When he left the prison gates, the world had changed, but so had he. Gone was the angry rebel who shouted in beer halls. What walked out was a man who had learned patience and purpose. Germany was weak, broken by war, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. Millions were jobless, families starved. The old government talked of democracy, but gave people only despair. And despair is easy to guide when someone offers hope. He began again, not with weapons, but with words. He built his party from the ashes. Small meetings turned into rallies. Rallies became movements. And soon, the brown uniforms were back. Not as rebels, but as symbols of unity and pride. He spoke of restoring Germany's greatness, of rebuilding its army, of giving every man work, every family bread. He told people they had been betrayed, that enemies hid among them, and they believed him, because he said it with conviction, because he made their suffering sound noble. The swastika became their flag, the salute their faith, the chants their music. Every word, every march, every speech, carefully crafted. He knew how to control the crowd. He had learned that emotion was stronger than reason, that people did not need truth, they needed belief. By the late 1920s, his name was known in every city. But the real opportunity came when the world fell again. The Great Depression. Banks collapsed. Factories closed. People lost everything. Money, homes, pride. Germany was on its knees. He saw it as destiny. While others wept, he rose. He promised jobs. He promised revenge. He promised a new beginning. Crowds filled stadiums to hear him speak. Thousands stood shoulder to shoulder, faces lifted, eyes burning with faith. They called him their voice, their leader, their hope. In 1932, his party became the largest in Germany. He was no longer shouting from the margins. He was standing at the door of power. But the old politicians still laughed. They thought they could use him, control him. They were wrong. In January 1933, the call came. The president appointed him Chancellor of Germany. Just like that, the boy from Braunau, the failed artist, the prisoner, had risen higher than anyone thought possible. That night, as he stood in front of the window of the chancellery, he looked down at the torchlight parade below. Flames flickered across his face. Thousands cheered his name. He didn't smile. He only watched, silent, calculating. He had reached the gates of power, but he was not satisfied. He didn't want to share it. He wanted it all. In the months that followed, freedom began to fade. Opponents were silenced, newspapers censored, the Reichstag burned, and with it, democracy itself. He blamed his enemies. The people believed him again. They begged him to protect them. And he did, by taking everything from them. One by one, the laws changed. One by one, voices disappeared, until only one remained. His. By 1934, he stood alone. The army swore loyalty not to Germany, but to him. The people called him Führer. He had become the nation itself. The path to power was complete. But beneath the parades and flags, beneath the songs and cheers, something darker was moving. A new empire was rising. Not of hope, but of fear. And as the world watched, uncertain and silent, the man who once dreamed of painting cities was now preparing to set them on fire. Chapter 6: The Machinery of Power. Power changes everything. It changes how a man walks, how he speaks, how he breathes. For Adolf Hitler, it became his air, his reason to exist. When he rose to power, Germany was broken, factories silent, streets filled with hunger. The people wanted hope, and he gave them something that looked like it. He promised pride, order, revival, and the nation listened, desperate to believe. He moved quickly. The microphones became his weapon, the rallies his stage. Every speech was crafted like a performance, light, sound, rhythm. Crowds of thousands stood in silence before roaring in unison. He understood the secret of control, emotion before reason. He filled the air with symbols, the flags, the marches, the salutes, all designed to make people feel part of something larger. The ordinary man was no longer small. He was part of the movement, part of a vision that promised greatness and demanded obedience. But behind the music and the banners, something darker was growing. Step by step, the machinery of power began to tighten. Freedom was replaced with fear. Dissent turned into danger. Books were burned, voices silenced. The newspapers printed only what he wanted, and the truth began to disappear. He built his empire not just with soldiers, but with minds. Children were taught to worship him. Schools taught loyalty, not thought. Every word, every lesson was meant to serve one purpose: devotion. The young no longer belonged to their parents. They belonged to the state. He surrounded himself with men who feared him and men who adored him. They wore uniforms, carried titles, and spoke of destiny. But beneath the discipline lay corruption and cruelty. Power does not share, and he shared nothing. Behind closed doors, the plans grew more precise. Laws were passed quietly. Neighbors began to vanish. Camps were built in silence, all in the name of purity, security, unity. The machinery worked without pause, without mercy. Propaganda was everywhere. Posters showed strength. Films glorified sacrifice. The people saw what they were meant to see. To question was betrayal. To doubt was treason. And soon, belief became law. He no longer saw individuals, only tools and threats. His dream of greatness had become an obsession with control. He no longer painted pictures. He painted nations. Each stroke drawn in fear, each color. Chapter 7. The World at War. War. It began not with thunder, but with a whisper, a promise, a march. And then the world caught fire. September 1st, 1939. German troops crossed into Poland. The sky filled with smoke. The cities shook. The world had hoped peace would last, but deep down, everyone knew it was only waiting. He called it destiny. He told his people it was their right to rise again, that Germany had been humiliated long enough, and millions believed him. The same voices that once cheered for jobs and order now cheered for conquest. In weeks, Poland fell, then Denmark, then Norway. The tanks moved like metal beasts across Europe. France collapsed in months. The swastika waved over Paris. To many, it seemed unstoppable. The world watched, frozen between fear and disbelief. He stood before his generals, eyes burning, hands trembling with excitement. He believed history was his to command, that the world itself was bending to his will. And, for a time, it seemed true. But behind the victories, something darker spread. Cities were emptied. Families were taken. Trains moved through the night, carrying names that would never return. The war was not only on the front lines. It was in the shadows, in the camps, in the silence. As the battles grew, so did his hunger. He turned east. Russia. A vast land he believed could be conquered in months. His armies marched into the snow, unprepared for what waited. At first, victory seemed close. But the winter, the endless cold, the resistance began to break the illusion. He would not listen. His generals begged him to retreat. He refused. He saw retreat as weakness. So, thousands froze. Thousands starved. And still, he demanded more. The war that once made him powerful now began to consume him. Allies turned to enemies. Confidence turned to paranoia. He saw betrayal in every corner. He trusted only himself and his rage. By 1943, the world had changed. the skies above Germany filled with bombers. Cities that once cheered his name now burned through the night. But he kept speaking of victory, of miracles that would never come. Reality had become another enemy. His empire began to crumble. Italy fell. The Allies landed in France. The Red Army pushed west, taking back what had been lost. Every step forward for them was another step backward for him. Yet, in his speeches, he smiled. He told his people the struggle would make them stronger, that the weak would fall, and the strong would rebuild. Even as the ground beneath him cracked, he spoke as if he were immortal. But war does not wait for belief. It only takes. It takes lives, cities, dreams, until there is nothing left. By 1945, Berlin was in ruins. The empire he promised to last 1,000 years was ash and silence. The soldiers who once marched with pride now fought only to survive. The flags were torn, the crowds were gone, and in the darkness of his bunker, the man who had once moved nations sat alone. Outside, the world was changing again. Armies closed in from every side. The echo of bombs shook the streets. He had created a world at war, and now the war had come for him. He looked at the maps. The lines of conquest that once stretched across Europe were gone. Only fragments remained. He spoke less. He slept less. He trusted no one. History had caught up. The voice that once ruled millions had become a whisper. The man who dreamed of empire now feared his own shadow. And soon, the war that began with his fire would end in his silence, and the silence of millions more. Chapter 8. The Eastern Front. June 22nd, 1941. The morning was quiet. The sun had just begun to rise over the forests and fields of the Soviet border, and then the silence broke. Engines roared. Guns thundered. Operation Barbarossa had begun. 3 million German soldiers crossed the frontier. They came in waves, tanks, planes, trucks, men. The largest invasion the world had ever seen. Hitler believed it would be swift. He believed the Red Army would collapse in weeks. He called it a crusade, a holy war against communism. But beneath his words, it was hunger for empire. At first, victory came easily. Cities fell like dominoes. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. Prisoners marched by the thousands, their faces grey with dust and fear. In Berlin, crowds cheered. The newspapers spoke of triumph, of destiny fulfilled. He told his people the war in the East was nearly won. But the land had other plans. Russia was vast, endless. The roads turned to mud, the skies darkened with rain. Machines sank, horses died. The soldiers grew weary. They marched for miles, only to find more emptiness, more resistance.
And still, the order was to advance. The Soviets refused to die. Factories deep inside the country kept working day and night. Trains carried tanks, weapons, men. For every city lost, another rose behind it. The Red Army began to strike back, slowly at first, then stronger, like a wounded animal finding its rage. By autumn, the Germans reached the gates of Moscow. They could see the city lights. They thought victory was near, but winter came, brutal and merciless. Temperatures fell below 40 degrees. Engines froze. Fingers blackened. Men wrapped themselves in rags and prayed for warmth. The snow buried the dream of conquest, and Russia was vast, endless. The roads turned to mud, the skies darkened with rain. Machines sank, horses died. The soldiers grew weary. They marched for miles, only to find more emptiness, more resistance. And still, the order was to advance. The Soviets refused to die. Factories deep inside the country kept working day and night. Trains carried tanks, weapons, men. For every city lost, another rose behind it. The Red Army began to strike back, slowly at first, then stronger, like a wounded animal finding its rage. By autumn, the Germans reached the gates of Moscow. They could see the city lights. They thought victory was near, but winter came, brutal and merciless. Temperatures fell below 40 degrees. Engines froze. Fingers blackened. Men wrapped themselves in rags and prayed for warmth. The snow buried the dream of conquest, and after Stalingrad, the war changed. The Soviet advance became relentless. Every field, every town was soaked in blood. Villages burned. Forests turned to ash. The ground itself seemed alive with ghosts. It was no longer about victory, only survival. And yet, he would not stop. He ordered more offensives, more men, more machines. The front stretched thousands of miles, from the Arctic to the Black Sea. But the tide had turned. The Red Army grew stronger. The German army grew weaker. By 1944, the East was collapsing. The Soviets pushed west, reclaiming their land. The soldiers who once marched proudly now ran from the storm. Hitler still spoke of miracles, of destiny, but his words had lost their power. In the snow and the smoke, the truth was clear. The empire he built on fear was falling apart. The eastern wind had become a hurricane, and it would not stop until it reached Berlin. Chapter 9. The Fall of the Third Reich. By 1943, the empire that once terrified the world was beginning to crack. The East was bleeding, the West was burning, and in the center stood a man who still believed he could command fate.
Hitler's armies were no longer marching forward. They were retreating, step by step, under skies filled with fire. Allied bombers crossed the clouds each night, turning German cities into seas of flame. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, places once proud now burned in silence. Inside his headquarters, the world grew smaller. Maps covered the walls. Pins and flags marked armies that no longer existed. He no longer trusted anyone. Not his generals, not his ministers, not even his oldest friends. He sat in long meetings, trembling hands clutching the table, eyes lost in dreams of victory that would never return. Every defeat had a scapegoat. Every mistake was betrayal. Reality no longer mattered, only belief. And that belief was eating him alive. In 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. The beaches of France exploded with noise and courage. The German soldiers fought hard, but the tide was unstoppable. The invasion broke the Western Wall. A second front had opened, and Germany could no longer defend both sides. That same summer, a group of German officers tried to end it. They placed a bomb in his meeting room. The July 20th plot. The explosion tore through the air, killing some, wounding others. But he survived. He called it fate. He said destiny had spared him for a reason. In truth, it only deepened his madness. The revenge was swift. Thousands were arrested. Many were hanged with piano wire, their deaths filmed as warnings. The regime turned inward, feeding on fear. No one was safe. Even loyalty could not save you.
Meanwhile, the Red Army moved west.
City after city fell. The Soviet advance was relentless, cold, methodical, unstoppable. By early 1945, they reached the outskirts of Berlin. The once mighty capital was now a ruin. Streets shattered, children carried rifles, civilians dug trenches in the parks. The sound of artillery rolled closer each night. Inside the bunker beneath the Reich chancellery, Hitler waited. Concrete walls, dim lights, stale air. He lived underground like a ghost. He held meetings no one believed in. He issued orders no one could follow. Above him, Berlin was dying. Those who saw him in those final days spoke quietly. His face was pale. His hands shook. He walked with a limp, muttering to himself. Sometimes he spoke of new weapons that would change the war. Sometimes he spoke of history, of betrayal, of fate. But mostly, he sat in silence. Eva Braun stayed by his side. She still smiled, still believed, even as the world collapsed above them. They dined by candlelight, pretending the city was not burning. Outside, Soviet soldiers were only streets away. On April 30th, 1945, the end came quietly. He wrote a few words, said goodbye to his dog, and disappeared into a small room. A gunshot echoed through the bunker. And just like that, the voice that once commanded millions was gone. Above ground, the red flag rose over the Reichstag. The city
was smoke and silence. The war in Europe was over, but the price was beyond measure. More than 50 million lives gone, families broken, nations scarred. The empire that promised 1,000 years had lasted barely 12, and all that remained were ruins and questions. How did it happen? How did a single man lead a world into darkness? The answer lay not just in him, but in those who followed, those who feared, those who obeyed, those who stayed silent. When Berlin fell, the Third Reich ended, but its shadow remained. A warning carved into the memory of humanity. That power built on hate will always fall, and that no empire of fear can ever last forever.
Chapter 10: Legacy and Lessons.
When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world faced the ruins of an empire built on hate. Cities were dust, families broken, nations scarred. And in the middle of that silence stood the question that still haunts humanity. How could it happen? Adolf Hitler's story is not just the story of one man. It is a mirror, showing what fear, pride, and blind obedience can create. He rose not by strength alone, but through the weakness of others, through despair, division, and the longing for someone to blame. After the war, the world swore never again. But the lessons of that promise are fragile. Each generation must learn them anew, because the seeds of tyranny are small. They begin not with armies, but with words, with anger, with lies, with the belief that one life matters more than another. Today, his name belongs to history, but the echoes of his choices remain in the graves of millions, in the stories of survivors, and in the vigilance we must all keep. To remember is not to glorify, it is to guard the future. To see clearly how darkness begins, and to choose light instead. If you have stayed through this journey, thank you for listening, for reflecting, for remembering. History lives only when we care enough to understand it. If this story has touched you, please subscribe to the channel. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this video with someone who still believes in the power of learning from the past. Your support helps keep these stories alive, so that the voices of history, the warnings, the courage, the lessons will never fade. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and never stop asking what kind of world we can build if we dare to remember.